morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. It's arranged by Swesif, which is Sweden's Sustainable Investment Forum. Swesif is an independent member organisation that was founded in 2003. We have about 125 members, and most of those are asset owners and asset managers who are either based or have operations in Sweden. My name's Emma Henningsen. My day job is at AP7, the 7th Swedish Pension Fund. And until very recently, I was a member of the board of Swesif, and I'm moderating the discussions today. But I'm far from an expert on antimicrobial resistance, also known as AMR. And thank goodness we have an excellent group of speakers to talk about it. But AMR, it occurs when bacteria and viruses change over time and become resistant to the treatment of modern medicines. It's estimated to directly cause over 1.2 million deaths annually and is a contributing factor in many, many more. And it's a global and growing problem. The misuse and the overuse of antibiotics in animals and humans are one of the leading causes of the escalation of the problem, and that's the focus of the webinar today. So in the coming hour, we're going to be hearing from a group of experts who will explain the problem, illustrate the risks, and discuss what's needed to mitigate them. So we hope to provide you with some greater knowledge on the topic, but also inspiration that will help you and enable you to act within your organisation on this topic. So our speakers today, and I can see you're putting on your cameras, thank you. And if you can give a wave as I say your name, we've got Teni Ekundare, who's Head of Investor Outreach at FAIRR, and you'll find out what FAIRR is and what they do shortly. We have Maria Lundesjö, who's Project Manager for Future Food at Axe Foundation. We have Stina Prince, who is Sustainability Strategist at Coop Sverige. And last but not least, we have Jenny Arén, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at Tundra Fonder. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Teni, who's going to talk about the problem, the background, and the ways in which FAIRR is working to support investors on this topic. Over to you, Teni.
Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you all for being able to join us this morning. And so what I'll do is just really run through a little bit about what FAIRR is about, how it is that we operate, and then really wanting to dig deep into the issue when it comes to AMR. So for those not familiar with us, we are a global investor network focused on addressing the ESG risks as well as the opportunities within the animal protein industry. And we support asset owners and asset managers by providing the knowledge and the resources throughout the investment decision-making process, and also supporting them with their stewardship activity. So there's a bit of an echo there. So at FAIRR, what that means in terms of the support is to ensure that we are helping when it comes to defining some of these material risks that exist in this sector, whether that's looking at working conditions and the inadequate safety practices, or biodiversity and deforestation risk, where we are seeing the animal agriculture is a huge causation of the deforestation in Amazon, or looking at climate impacts, or of course what we're here today to discuss is the antibiotics usage. Now, we also analyze and engage with companies along the value chain from farm to fork, and even one step before that, from farmer to fork, given that animal agriculture is a significant consumer of pharmaceutical products. So this industry consumes more than 70 to 80% of all antibiotics in the US, and over half of antibiotics sold globally go into our animal production system. And in our view, if we want to address some of the most material ESG risks facing us today, we really do need to ensure that investors are galvanized to analyze and engage with their portfolio companies all along the supply chain. And we provide a range of research and tools on our website to support our investor network, whether that's on policy, climate, alternative proteins, or engagements, whether collaborative or individual engagements, because we really do believe that investors need access to the research and specialist resources to understand the ESG risks in their portfolios and to take action as it relates to the food supply chain. So today we will be focusing on AMR. We will examine the human and economic cost of AMR, the impact that animal agriculture and the animal pharmaceutical industries have on increasing the risk of AMR, and the roles that companies, policymakers, and of course investors have in supporting the industry in mitigating some of the riskier practices that increase AMR. So I want to kick off by giving some background on this issue. Now, last year, the World Health Organization named AMR as a top 10 global health threat. And we had the Lancet report published in January this year, and it gave some pretty frankly shocking figures on the impact of AMR. So in 2019, the direct deaths per year attributed to this were 1.3 million deaths. And in fact, when you consider deaths which are indirectly associated with AMR, that stood at nearly 5 million. These figures are much higher than were previously calculated and shows that AMR is growing as a threat to human health. And it's not just the human health side of things. Economically, AMR is estimated to cost the US $35 billion today, and it could cost the global economy about $100 trillion by 2050. And in response to this global threat, we are seeing G7 health and finance ministers recognizing it, committing last year to working together to curb the silent pandemic of AMR. And this silent pandemic is largely due to the inappropriate use and overuse of antimicrobials in humans, but also significantly in animals. And antimicrobial resistant bacteria originating in animals can be transmitted to humans through the environment, through the food we eat, or through direct contact with these animals. And it makes antibiotic stewardship in the food supply chain an absolute necessity, as well as an urgent human health issue. And the reason why we have such large amounts of antibiotics used in animal agriculture is really largely because of the intensive nature which the animal and agriculture industry has evolved into. So we have crowded, unsanitary conditions where animals are packed tightly together. It means there's a lot of stress on them, which impacts their immune systems. And this makes it much easier for illness to occur and pathogens to breed, and so therefore for antibiotics to then be introduced to them. And there is an additional benefit from some antibiotics, which when fed to animals can actually act as a growth promoter. So then you run the risk of farmers giving antibiotics to animals, not so much in terms of the sick animals, but using it to improve weight gain and therefore try and boost the yield that they're getting per animal on that front. And so it's not the responsible use of antibiotics, which is what we really need to raise the standard to and to maintain. And the uses in the industry impacts the environment, as we see that 80% of the antibiotics that are consumed by the animal actually does end up being excreted. So running the risk of polluting the environment in terms of water and manure, and so spreading that risk of AMR into wider communities and the environment around them. And AMR impacts so many aspects of society, whether that's on healthcare or thinking about insurance provisions or general human and economic activities. But despite the magnitude of the threat, the risks, it seems, are not being fully addressed or priced into investment decisions, or sufficient action really being taken to reduce that risk. And so FAIRR, alongside other leading bodies, encourage a One Health approach to AMR stewardship, because AMR is an issue that needs a coordinated response. We cannot think of it as or of addressing it from only the human health or the animal health or even the environmental health aspects, but we need to make sure that we're looking at it holistically after all aspects of health in the ecosystem. And similarly, in terms of how we do that, we need to ensure that all stakeholders are involved. So consumers to corporate, regulators to investors, we all have a part to play in ensuring that we're starting to decrease the total use and really promote the responsible use of the antibiotics that we have today. And we need to start thinking about what the alternatives are as well, and how it is that we can ensure that the antibiotic use is being reduced, particularly in the livestock industry, which accounts for so much of the usage that we see on the planet today. And when it comes to reducing antibiotics usage, there are some green shoots of hope. There have been reductions observed over the last decade, and this reduction can be attributed to regulation, particularly the bans on antibiotic growth promoters, but also on shifting consumer preferences as well. and consumers are increasingly looking for animal proteins being produced with fewer or no antibiotics used ever. And this is a trend that we particularly see in the US. Now, these reductions are encouraging, definitely, and show that it's possible to raise animals successfully without the routine use of antibiotics. And indeed, that's something that the Nordic regions have also done successfully. So this chart is showing how sales of antibiotics have been decreasing in the last decade, although data for the EU for 2019 still hasn't been released, hasn't been made available yet. But in the US, we can see a decrease of about 26% between its peak in 2015 to 2019. In the EU, it's reduced by just about 30%, and it's almost halved in the UK since 2012. So pointing out the UK, actually, it's interesting to note that reductions of antibiotics there have been largely voluntary. It's been achieved through effective stakeholder engagement between the vets, the farmers, governments, and other organizations such as National Farmers Union. And again, this shows that multi-stakeholder engagement really does work. Now, that is all very encouraging. However, we still believe that more reduction is needed. And in fact, data shows that in the US, antibiotics usage actually increased from 2017 to 2018. And this isn't just a developed markets phenomenon. The antibiotic usage in emerging markets also has an impact on global AMR risk. And this is an area where there's supposed to be a forecast increase in animal protein consumption. So we are seeing more intensification of animal production in these regions. We are seeing more industrialization of animal protein production, and that the increasing industrialization combined with a lower regulatory threshold does mean that we are experiencing increased use of antibiotics in some of these emerging markets. And we don't get adequate disclosure still from some of these countries. So, for example, Brazil and India don't actually disclose publicly on antimicrobial usage at all. And in China, we're not getting that data annually. So it means that reporting is lacking in the countries with the fastest growing animal agriculture industries. And we need to engage to encourage better disclosure in this regard. So I've talked about the usage of antibiotics, but I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the suppliers of antibiotics as well and the role that they have to play. So at FAIRR, we published a report last year examining the animal health industry through an AMR lens in order to help investors to integrate AMR into their investment decision-making process when looking at animal pharmaceutical companies. So through this work, we've investigated the role that companies play in addressing AMR and also what current practices and policies exist within the industry. And this has informed our framework for best practice AMR stewardship, which can be used to assess company performance. And while there has been investor attention and action focused on the animal protein producers, on the food retailers, and on restaurant chains to drive down the antibiotic usage, the animal health industry is the first step in the supply chain for antibiotics. And yet so far it hasn't received much attention from investors on this specific issue. And we believe that this will change. The more that we see AMR coming into public consciousness, the more we see AMR coming into regulatory focus, we believe that more investors are going to be focusing on these companies and the spotlight being brought to bear on them to do more. So in assessing what best practice AMR stewardship looks like, we believe 4 key areas need to be addressed. We need to understand the manufacturing practices to see what regulatory standards are being upheld by these companies. So, for example, is wastewater being treated, or what efforts are being made to limit AMR risk to employees and local communities? We also need to think about the sales and marketing practices. So how are these companies going beyond just meeting local regulatory requirements, but also taking into account issues such as the marketing and labeling and packaging of the antibiotics to help reduce usage and increase responsible usage. R&D, for example, is a company investing into alternatives to antibiotics? And does the company actually even acknowledge the role that it has in addressing AMR and adopting a One Health approach? So this means greater oversight across its global supply chains to ensure that its own stewardship efforts at the head office at the boardroom level are not being undermined by other company actions elsewhere in its global ecosystem. And it also means recognizing that lobbying activities can undermine stewardship efforts as well. And it's worth pointing out that evidence suggests that lobbying efforts by these animal health companies, both directly and also indirectly through industry bodies representing them, run contradictory to AMR stewardship efforts. So in 2019, we've seen animal health companies spend over $3 million lobbying in the US and in Europe, where we get most data on issues such as tax, trade, AMR, and agriculture. And admittedly, there's a lack of transparency on what exactly these lobbying activities support. But if animal health companies are similar to other industries like the oil and gas industry or the meat and dairy industry, then they do tend to lobby in favor of less stringent regulation. So despite publicly championing AMR stewardship efforts, we find that leading animal health companies appear to be devoting their resources to lobby against bills aimed at safeguarding AMR for human medicine in order to be able to continue using them in animals. And so we believe that disclosure by these animal health companies of how their lobbying aligns with their stewardship efforts on AMR would be very much welcomed. And just focusing for a moment on regulation and policy, there are just two areas I'd like to mention here. First, the EU ban on the prophylactic use of antimicrobials for animal agriculture came into effect in January of this year. And this really is a milestone in terms of regulation and reduction of antibiotic use in animals. It includes new powers for the European Parliament to completely exclude certain last resort antibiotics used in human medicine from being used in farming at all. And it's an important step because there's sometimes very little difference between the dosage used for growth promotion and the dosage used for prophylactic treatment of a herd. And this means that the restriction for use for growth promotion may have little impact on the total volume of antibiotics actually used in the industry. And given the volumes that are used in animals, this legislation is something which should really be encouraged, and be great to see other countries develop and enforce it as well. Now, secondly, one to watch is the EU taxonomy, where the investors have been vocal in feedback on the taxonomy's aims when it comes to establishing that EU-wide classification framework, so that companies and investors have that common language to identify which economic activities are actually environmentally sustainable. Now, towards the end of last year, there was an investor letter which was supported by $3.5 trillion in assets, calling on the EU to ensure the taxonomy is as robust as possible when it comes to agriculture, particularly stating that antibiotic usage should be covered in the do no significant harm criteria. And after disagreement amongst multiple stakeholders, unfortunately, the decision for agriculture was delayed, and we haven't had an update on that situation. So it's still one to watch with regards to its approach to agriculture and antibiotics usage, and we will be following with interest. And we would encourage investors as well to be looking to see how it is that the EU taxonomy does treat and address animal agriculture. So I've talked about AMR. I've talked about the risk it presents to humans, to animals, and environmental health, the need for that One Health approach, the role of animal agriculture and the pharmaceutical companies, as well as recent EU regulation and things to watch for. So the very last thing I'd like to mention is the role of investors. Now, we have an initiative called the Invest Action on AMR, which was launched in 2020 in collaboration with the PRI, the UK Department of Health, and the Access to Medicine Foundation. And it's a great example of that One Health approach, bridging the policy, investor, and research worlds, and using a diverse global coalition to avoid acting in silos and really helping to coordinate global action. It has a range of investors involved, all performing different actions to address AMR, and we always welcome new participants as well. In fact, one of the members of the Invest Action on AMR will be discussing the work that she does, Teni Ekundare, later on this morning. But just to give ideas and potential food for thought, some of the ways that investors are really driving change through this investor action are engaging with protein producers or restaurant brands, encouraging robust antibiotic policies to be applied all along their supply chains, or filing shareholder proposals on antibiotics policies, or even developing step-by-step guides on how investors can adopt that AMR lens and integrate risk into analysis. So we also saw reference to AMR in the G7 finance minister statement in December, where they welcomed efforts by this initiative as well as others to better assess and mitigate AMR risk and impact in their investments and financing strategies. And the finance ministers committed to take specific action to address antibiotic market failure. Investor voices played an important role in achieving the recognition of AMR as a material financial risk, ensuring that AMR is looked at as more than only a public health issue at a policy level. And investors continue to have a role to play to encourage better AMR stewardship from companies, from policymakers, and from themselves as well. So I'll leave it there for now, but thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I'll pass it back to Emma at this stage.
Thanks very much, Teni. Just before we move on to our next speaker, I wonder, maybe could you say anything about the work with shareholder resolutions? Are there resolutions coming up this season that we should be keeping an eye on?
So it's interesting because shareholder resolutions has really increased in focus and attention from investors as another tool in the arsenal when it comes to actually engaging with companies. And there's been this move away from just, not knee-jerk, but there's been a move away from you engage in company dialogue. If you don't get to it, then maybe consider divestment, to actually understanding the need to carry on working with companies. And so when it comes to shareholder resolutions, there's been a real increase in terms of one specifically focused on antibiotics. In the past, we've seen some targeting some of the restaurant companies, the McDonald's and Yum brands of the world. We have had one on Hormel early on this year, and there's one on Costco as well. And these are looking to see how these companies are actually considering their usage of medically important antibiotics and how it is that they're seeking to reduce that usage. So I think that the shareholder voting season has become more and more of a burden in increasing years. But there certainly is a role to play in terms of ensuring that investors are looking and assessing some of these resolutions. So at FAIRR, for example, while we do not recommend a vote for or against any of these resolutions, we will always provide the facts and the data behind it to help support our members in making their decision of what to support.
Thanks very much. That's great, Teni. So we'll come back and pick up the conversation in the Q&A, but now I'd like to pass on to Maria Lundesjö from Axe Foundation. Over to you to talk with a little bit of a Swedish perspective, but also on a very interesting network that you're running. Over to you.
Thank you. So can you see my presentation now?
That's perfect.
Perfect. My name is Maria Lundesjö, and I work at Axe Foundation. And we are an independent, non-profit organization working practically to accelerate the solutions for a more sustainable world. Our absolute core is projects creating concrete change. So in our projects, we work practically together with a wide range of actors across sectors and industries. Together, we develop and accelerate concrete solutions to local and global sustainability challenges, and we share them. So we are definitely more of a do tank than a think tank, and we address challenges related to the things we buy, the food we eat, and the resources we use. So we believe in business as a driving force for change, and we often run initiatives in close collaboration with the business. Our work with antibiotic resistance increased in speed when Åsa Domey, who is a sustainability manager at Axfood, came to us with the question already in 2013. She wanted to know what they could do as a company to reduce the use of antibiotics in food-producing animals and also encourage others to do the same. Teni already talked a bit about these numbers. It can be really hard to understand the seriousness in the case of antibiotic resistance and its connection to food, and it's therefore sometimes called the silent tsunami, something that happens behind. Since antibiotic overuse is a widespread problem in food production, and there is this clear link between substandard animal husbandry and extensive use of antibiotics, it's important to know that one of the reasons that the resistance is increasing is that we, in the global perspective, use more antibiotics for healthy animals than to sick humans. About 70% on a global level is used for food-producing animals, but in Sweden that number is only 13%. Sweden has shown that it is possible to reduce the use of antibiotics radically while still maintaining production. So the new EU legislation will hopefully help more EU countries improve their work within this area, and similar legislation as the EU legislation has already been in place in Sweden for 30 years. So there are also large differences in the use of antibiotics between countries, but it's also a large difference within countries. This figure shows the sales in ton of active substance of veterinary medicinal products marketed mainly for food-producing animals, listed by country in 2020. And it's a corrected unit. The population correction unit is applied as a proxy for the size of the food-producing animal population within the country. So as you see, compared with many countries, Sweden has a very low consumption. But in several countries, both within the EU and outside of EU, the problem is big. And the problem is often that antibiotics not only is used when the animals are sick, but also for preventive purposes to enable keeping the animals healthy in a substandard environment. Antibiotics are also still used for purely growth promotion purposes, a procedure that was banned in Sweden already in 1986 and within the EU in 2006. But it is important to know that trade and business relations are not made between countries, but between suppliers and buyers. So the national averages is a good tool when approaching a new supplier. Within a country, there can be large differences and major possibilities to find producers that already have an antibiotic, responsible antibiotic use. So therefore, the continuous dialogue between suppliers and buyers are very important when it comes to setting demands for a production standard related to antibiotic use. To reverse the trend of increased antibiotic resistance, all sectors need to take responsibility. Since the largest use of antibiotics is in animal husbandry, all actors in the food chain have a responsibility to minimize the spread of this antibiotic resistance in food-producing animals, and we need to do it together. As an example of that, I will now present Axe Foundation's work with the antibiotic criteria and the antibiotic platform from farm to fork. So the antibiotic criteria is a voluntary list for antibiotic use and animal husbandry that food companies can set for suppliers when purchasing meat, dairy products, and seafood. To create this, Axe Foundation gathered companies, academia, authorities, industry associations, and civil society organizations, and together we developed this clear list of criteria and an associated questionnaire that buyers can use in the dialogues with suppliers of animal food products. So by working together, we can jointly reduce the use of antibiotics and contribute to better animal welfare. And it's important to stress that the collaboration between the expert group and the reference group in this project was the most important factor to make this possible. So the criteria was first developed in 2013, 2014, after this question raised by Axfood. And during 2019 to 2020, Axe Foundation, together with the reference group, updated the antibiotic criteria to adapt to new legislation, changes in consumer behavior, and to further encourage a positive development in animal food production. So Axe Foundation's criteria 2.0 is they go beyond legislation and they include meat and dairy products as well as fish and other seafood. So there are 8 criteria in the antibiotic criteria list addressing both direct antibiotic use and preventive interventions that can lead to reduced antibiotic use. So in short, criterion 1 through 5 is directly aimed towards reducing the use of antibiotics by setting the bounds regarding use for growth promotions and group treatments. It's also stated that antibiotics has to be thoroughly prescribed by a veterinarian, and it needs to be properly documented. And the use of antibiotic types important for human healthcare has also been restricted in this document. Criterion 6 to 8 is about preventive actions, such as routines regarding minimizing infection spread, giving the animals space to move freely, and not use mutilations to mask inadequate animal husbandry. It is very important for us, given these 8 criteria, that animals that are ill and need treatment should get treatment. But we all have a responsibility to prevent that the use, as far as possible, are diminished, and that we should give the animal good care and possibilities to stay healthy. So for each criterion, there are also associated questions to use for supplier dialogue and follow-ups, and the full toolbox can be accessed on our website, and it's free to download and use. This process also led to that the Swedish Food Retailers Federation adopted a new common policy in 2020 based on the first 6 of these 8 updated criteria. So it means that all retailers have agreed to work actively with these questions. It's important to them and important to their customers. So when we did this work with the antibiotic criteria, we also wondered if there was a need for and maybe a potential value in developing a Swedish platform for collaborating on the issue of antibiotic resistance. So maybe this platform could contribute to quickening the pace of the Swedish food sector's work against antibiotic resistance. So in 2020, Axe Foundation and the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry carried out a survey of existing networks and platforms and identified key players on the antibiotic issue in Sweden's food sector. So we did a needs analysis and through interviews and a survey, and this showed that there was a clear need to coordinate and gather actors across the sectors in various ways to make this go quicker. There were also a demand for networking around these questions. So the conclusions from this collaboration led the foundation for the creation of the antibiotic platform from farm to fork. So this work shows us that the actors across sectors primarily need support in 3 areas to contribute to the work against antibiotic resistance. They need systematic monitoring and reporting on the development in the AMR world, exactly what Teni described. They need help with practical work in the supply chain, and they need networking and contact points. So it turned out that one of the most valuable results in the development of the antibiotic criteria was the sharing and exchange of knowledge between the partners in the reference group. Especially knowledge related to practical challenge in the work was appreciated. So therefore we created 2 initiatives. The antibiotic dialogue, where organizations within the food industry actually can meet and exchange knowledge and experience to support the practical work like supply audits and setting the requirements within their organizations. And the other one is an open knowledge and networking activities. So we arrange seminars and roundtable meetings to build and share the knowledge and facilitate relationship building within this area. And all these themes that we work with are actually based on the stakeholder needs. So this platform has been initially piloted now and developed over 1 year, and it will be evaluated in the end of 2022. I just want to give a short tip. If you want to stay informed about the antibiotic resistance and the condition in Sweden, we have this newsletter. So far, it's only in Swedish, but it's free, curated, and it ends up in your mailbox every other week. And last, I just want to acknowledge that this question is really important. And in 2021, the antibiotic criteria was awarded the Venture of the Year by the Sustainable Brand Index, which is Europe's largest independent brand study focused on sustainability. And an important ingredient, according to the jury, was the broad industry collaboration. So if we can, within this project, so if we can extend that collaboration into the financial sector, this discussion would be even more powerful and drive it towards a more sustainable food sector. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Maria. And wow, what a lot of work and well covered in 10 minutes. So thanks for all of that information. I'm going to hand over now to Stina Prinz. She's at Coop Sweden, and to hear really, and I know you've worked in collaboration with Axe Foundation and with Maria. You're one of the participants in this network. So it'd be great to hear how you are working with your suppliers or any particular suppliers to address the issue. Over to you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about how we as a retailer in Sweden can make a difference regarding the global use of antibiotics in the animal production. The overuse of antibiotic is very much a result of lack of knowledge, both at farmers, suppliers, and also the lack of knowledge and the non-existing requirements from the suppliers. We at Coop Sweden have had the criteria that Maria talked about in our contracts with the suppliers since I think about 2015. And we only work with selected suppliers that can really prove and show that they live up to them. So I'm going to tell you a bit about an example from Spain, Serrano ham production. And in 2016, when the antibiotic criteria were new, we started by auditing our suppliers in countries with very high antibiotic sales, for example, Spain. And when we do audits, we both visit the slaughterhouse, the production plants, but then always we go out to farm as well. So we go to maybe 3 to 5 different farms to see how it works in reality. And in 2016, when we visit our supplier, we could see that antibiotics were used in the feed and in the water for all the animals. They used the broad spectrum antibiotics when the animals were sick while waiting for analytical results. And that is something that really drives resistance. And we could also see that there were no monitoring and no reduction targets. So we said to the supplier that if they're going to continue to be our suppliers, we need to see some improvements. But still we gave them a chance since the criteria were so new. And we said that they needed to work on this and they needed to report back to us every 6 months their improvement. And then I got back there visited the same suppliers in 2018, and I was pretty amazed about the progress that they have actually done. Because now we could see that there were no prophylactic treatment, the monitoring and targets on all the antibiotics used, and we could also see a sharp reduction of the use. And this shows that by setting requirements and also explaining them and educate the suppliers, and also really make it a part of the business, say that if you don't do this, you can't be a supplier to us. That can really make a difference. And then this knowledge will also be spread throughout the suppliers, the farmers, and also to other retailers that can see, okay, Coop Sweden has been able to make these requirements, then maybe we can also do it. Like we collaborate with Coop in the other Nordic countries, and they have also adapted these requirements after that we could show that we can really do this. So in that way, we can spread the knowledge and really make a difference. And in my last slide, I will show how Coop Sweden implement AMR in all our decisions. This is the Coop Sweden's sustainability declaration. That is a tool that visualizes the product sustainability footprint out of 10 different sustainable aspects. And animal welfare and antibiotic is one of these aspects. And we have this declaration for about 75% of our food assortment today, and we aim for 100%. And this is used both as a purchasing tool for evaluating of products and suppliers, but it's also available for the consumers to help them to make sustainable choices. And we have set targets on all these 10 different aspects, so it's really included in our everyday business, and is something that our buyers needs to work on and really show how they work with their assortment to lower the use of antibiotics. Yep, that was my last one.
Dina, thanks very much. Great to hear what an impact those conversations had in that particular case. Well done. That's really, really helpful and inspiring to hear. I'd like to pass over now to Jenny Arén, who is at Tundrafonde, an investor in the frontier markets, right, Jenny? And emerging markets. We'd love to hear what you have to say on the topic. And you also happen to be an epidemiologist, one of those very popular working groups these days. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Emma. I'm happy to be here. So I will briefly, in 5 minutes, cover what we've been doing. I thought we were doing very little, but I realized we actually do a lot for our size. So that's right. I have a background in public and global health, and I can call myself an epidemiologist, which I don't have to explain to anyone anymore. And I think this really also relates to this topic of a silent pandemic, which could be far worse than what we have seen during the past 2 years. So we invest in frontier markets, and early emerging markets are the countries where we are currently invested corresponds to about the size of 3 EUs. So that's a lot of people affected. And unfortunately, also, as we've heard from Teni earlier, from FAIRR, that the use of antibiotics in these countries is not always proper, and it's developing at a really fast pace. And it's not just overuse, it's misuse, and it's a very unfortunate development in this case. So what can we do, as we are a small Swedish investor, invested in countries like Pakistan, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and a few countries in Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and so on. All countries with a rapidly growing population, countries moving from lower income to lower middle income status, poor coverage of health providing services, hospitals, and pharmaceuticals. So there's this trade-off when it comes to these issues, to give the population access, but also to maintain responsibility. So we basically work with this question in 3 levels or 3 different areas. We work with our portfolio companies through engagement, which is kind of a preventive measure where we send questionnaires, we discuss all sorts of questions with the companies to just raise awareness, to get the data, and to provide our perspective, what's important to us as investors. Global health has been part of these questions for the past 5 years, as have AMR. So we, in this aspect, we focus on certain countries where it's especially cumbersome. So Vietnam, for example, can be described as a potential hotspot for this emergence of AMR. due to the burden of high burden of infectious diseases, and also with the misuse and overuse of antibiotics. According to reports, about 90% of drugstores in the country can be as many as 97% prescribe or dispense antibiotics without prescriptions. And of course, we also focus on certain sectors like the healthcare sector, pharmaceuticals, hospital services, and consumer staples, with special attention to food production and protein producers and so on. So samples of these small interactions could be in our questionnaire or in direct meetings. We ask, are you aware of this major threat of AMR? Because it should be mentioned that in our markets, the awareness is generally quite low on these issues. So we ask to raise awareness and to share the perspective and to make sure that this becomes a part of their own processes. We ask the questions, and we ask if they are planning or if they have been involved in campaigns regarding misuse of antibiotics. And we ask for policies, and we ask to share. Do you have a policy for the use of AMR? And please share. So that's one level. Then we work on the exclusion and more of a follow-up for controversies. So this and exclusions, of course, could be that we do not even invest in companies that do not have proper policies and are not being following international guidelines on different areas. And this is, of course, one more area where we wouldn't even invest if we do not consider this company long-term sustainable. So and also, of course, we can use divestments for leverage to drive these conversations with the companies. And in this case, we can mention Bangladesh as an example. It's a unique case of the least developed countries, where most of the pharma companies in the countries have this. They don't have to sort under the patent, so they produce generics or non-branded medicines. And obviously, this is a very, very important in a country with poor healthcare. So we need to consider also the fact that the population needs to have access to medicines, which is why we also part up with initiatives like the ones Teni was referring to, Access to Medicine Foundation. But we also want the production and the distribution to be responsible. So then we are currently in a dialogue with a company that's been running for over 4 years, and it's more of a work in progress where we share our opinion and our way and where we would like the company to, what direction we would like them to develop. So very short about that. So the third level of actions from our side is then collaborations, because we are small. So like to get the message across, to get more muscles, we are part of the FAIRR network. We are also contributing with different, participating in different statements and investor actions, like for example, the ones on AMR. But we also contributed with the engagement on an equal distribution of COVID vaccinations. So to us, these are very important questions. And this is, as we've heard earlier in this fabulous webinar, it's so much knowledge gathered. It's a privilege to listen to the others. And I think we need to consider that if we don't do anything about these, these countries, and we're just representing a few of the countries that are seeing new levels of use of antibiotics, which are affecting us and them in ways that cannot even be. We're looking at the 10 million in 2050. We've already seen a steep increase, and this will continue if this is not being handled. So basically, I think everyone should contribute, and if you feel there's a lack investor a lack of competence within your organization, you can team up with others. Was that 5 minutes?
I think so, roughly. Thanks very much, Jenny. It's really great to hear. Maybe if I could just follow up straight to you and we'll sort of move into the Q&A. I wonder, could you say anything about the impact of AMR in relation to the COVID pandemic? Has it had an impact there?
Yeah, it's actually, I found this meta-analysis is just published now in March. I can share later the publication if anyone is interested, but there is the prevalence of AMR in COVID patients, especially in countries outside of Europe and in ICU units, is very high generally. And there are worries that the use of antibiotics during the pandemic, because this is what, not to scare everyone, but this is what to be expected when you get a new disease without a cure. So antibiotics was used not in a proper way, which is probably contributed to make this increase even higher and faster. So definitely, I think, but this is yet to be elaborated. I think people in the field of epidemiology will be quite busy in the 5 coming years to analyze this.
Yes, unfortunately, I'd have to agree with you, I think. Maybe you can ask all the speakers to put your cameras on again, please. And we haven't got long, but we've got time for a few short questions. And I wondered if I could turn first to Stina and to Maria and ask, we've heard a little bit about the EU regulation, which is to limit the prophylactic use of antibiotics. Will we see, are you expecting to see a big change as a result of this? And are there any risks that could lead to falls in production or problems in production in some countries where farmers are forced to change their production methods? Or am I putting too much optimism in the strength of regulation? Stina, have you got anything you'd like to kick off?
Yeah, of course, the new legislation is very important and it's a milestone that we have it. So of course it's very positive, but I still think that we need to wait and see the effect of it and see will it actually lower the usage of antibiotics, because we can't just say, okay, now it's not a problem anymore. Now we don't need to have our own requirements and we don't need to do the follow-up. I still think that we need to focus on the antibiotic usage and also the animal welfare of the animals, because if we have a bad animal welfare, they will get sick and the use of antibiotic will continue to stay high.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's good that the legislation is in place, but to implement it will take a long time. So I think it's really important that meanwhile we do all we can to work with parallel initiatives like the ones where suppliers or buyers set demands on suppliers directly.
Are there any plans, Maria, to expand your work more internationally, or is it already quite international?
We're trying, but it's a bit hard. Sweden is a very open country in relation to sharing things, although you are in the same kind of business sector. It's not so easy in other countries. And we've also found that the supplier-buyer relation is a bit different in other countries. So our model is, well, it's very Swedish. It turned out to be very Swedish, but it works well here. But we're trying to find other collaborations.
Okay, thanks. Good luck with that. Maybe team up with FAIRR, I would say. And over to you, Teni. We've had a really interesting story from Stina around managing to achieve some change in a company, in one of their suppliers. I wonder, it would be lovely to hear a positive news story from the investor side as well, if you've got one to share in this, on this scary topic.
Yes, I mean, and I have to say, similarly to what Jenny was saying in terms of the information, the knowledge that has been shared, I've really enjoyed listening in on this, and it's been really encouraging in terms of hearing from Stina, for example, and what it is that corporates are actually doing along the supply chain. And certainly when it comes to investors, we've heard from Jenny in terms of some of the actions that she's been taking. I would say that engagement really does work, and it's considering the severity and the magnitude of this problem. It's always, I think, as you said, I'm really encouraging to look for those good news stories. And with FAIRR, we tend to do more broad collaborative engagement. So a wide coalition of investors, but also a wide coalition of companies. And we had an engagement specifically on antibiotics, looking at 20 restaurant chains. So things like McDonald's, Darden Group, companies like that. And we were looking to see what kind of antibiotic policies they had in place along their supply chain and the strength of those policies. Now, when we started that engagement, this was in 2016, 2017, only one of those 20 companies even had an antibiotic policy that was established, that was publicly available, and that we could therefore assess. By the end of that engagement in 2019, all 20 of the companies either had a public policy or were in the process of developing one to release to the public. And it really helped us to recognize that companies will make that change if they are informed. And there is that issue when it comes to the knowledge side of things, which is what also led us to set up the Invest Accurate AMR, so that investors are able to share the knowledge. As Maria is saying, it can be difficult sometimes to have that knowledge sharing. So having it be a forum where they can, and also being able to support their engagements as well, does make a real difference. So it's not even just the engagement itself in terms of the results that we see there, but also how it then grows into other areas and other aspects to engage on as well.
Super. Thanks very much, Teni. We're really in the closing minutes, so I thought I'd just try and summarize what I've learned from this webinar. I think overuse is one of the key words that comes up for me. Substandard environment for animals and substandard animal welfare is really a strong contributing factor in AMR. But that there are clear sets of practical criteria that can be used to assess current practices. Another key point I picked up was the lack of knowledge and awareness on many markets for this. And the lack of systematic monitoring of antibiotic use. So setting requirements and having discussions, having dialogue, it seems to be a very powerful tool. Pleased to hear that happening in practice. I've also heard that policymakers are stepping up, but it's just the start of a process. There's a long way to go, and many geographies where there really is no policy making on this. And finally, then, that we've heard about investor actions that are leading to change and other initiatives ongoing. So there is scope to influence this issue and be a voice for good and for progress towards lower growth in antimicrobial resistance, which I think is in all of our best interests, both as investors, both as consumers, and also as people who get sick sometime and need those antibiotics to work. So I'd like to round off by saying thanks very much to Jenny, to Stina, to Teni and Maria. It's been a real pleasure to have you join this webinar. Thank you for all of your insights, and keep up the great work, and let's keep in touch. Thank you, everyone.